Philadelphia, 1964. Holmesburg Prison. In a dimly lit corridor, 10 black men lined the wall. Some shifted nervously, while others stood still as a stone. Each of these men were promised a $10 bill payment for what was about to be done to them. Down the hallway, Dr. Kligman emerged from the shadows, carrying his box of syringes. The men didn't know what was about to happen, that they were about to receive 7,500 micrograms of one of the most toxic chemicals ever created by humanity, 468 times above the safety limit. The first injection went in. Within hours, the man's skin began to change. Painful cysts erupted across his body. Pustules formed and burst. And that was the mildest case among the men. This wasn't a scene from a horror movie or a secret experiment by World War II Germany. No, this happened in an American prison, sanctioned by American institutions, conducted by one of America's most celebrated doctors. For 23 years, America's most trusted institutions transformed this prison into their private laboratory. They needed human test subjects, and they found them behind these walls. Black men who couldn't say no. Bodies that could be bought for just $10. You thought you knew the story of American medicine and scientific progress? When America's biggest companies needed test subjects for their products, they came here. When the U.S. Army wanted to test its chemical weapons, they came here. And when prestigious universities wanted bodies for their experiments, they came here. So what happens to a community when betrayal comes not from criminals, but from doctors in white coats? The very institutions meant to protect and heal us? If uncovering these buried truths matters to you, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. We bring these stories to light because they deserve to be heard. Let me paint you a picture of hell. Constructed in 1896, Holmesburg Prison was a large correctional facility in northeast Philadelphia, used to relieve overcrowding in other city jails. Surrounded by high stone walls and located near industrial neighborhoods, the prison became known over the years not only for its physical isolation, but also for its deteriorating conditions, poor sanitation, extreme heat in the summers, and limited oversight of inmate welfare. However, by the 1950s, it was bursting at the seams with people. But this wasn't just any prison population. Most of the inmates were black men. The lower-ranking guards were black too, while the white supervisors held all the power. Violence between inmates was common. Guard abuse was rampant. And in the suffocating summer heat, tension constantly simmered beneath the surface. But these inhumane conditions were comfort compared to what would happen within these walls. Because in this hellscape where black men were already treated like animals, someone saw an opportunity. His name was Albert Kligman, and he was no ordinary physician. By the time he arrived at Holmesburg Prison, he was already a rising star in dermatology, publishing studies, earning accolades, and building a name for himself at the University of Pennsylvania. But Kligman wasn't just interested in curing rashes or studying skin. He wanted access, control. And when he stepped into Holmesburg for the first time in 1951, he found both. He was there supposedly to help with an outbreak of athlete's foot, but what he saw that day sparked something far more sinister in his mind. This was the beginning of a 23-year nightmare, where black bodies would become nothing more than test subjects in a twisted scientific playground. See, inside these walls, freedom often cost less than $500. But with prison jobs paying just 15 to 25 cents a day, saving up that kind of money could take years. For many inmates, poor, mostly black, and often held on low bail, the experiments offered a quicker way out. Some tests paid as little as $10. Others offered $30, maybe $50 if you were lucky. It wasn't much, but in Holmesburg, even a few dollars meant food, soap, stamps, or a shot at hiring a lawyer to fight your case. And so many found themselves trapped in a brutal equation, your body for their research. As Leotis Jones, a former inmate, put it, "I was in prison with a low bail. I couldn't afford the money to pay for bail. I knew that I wasn't guilty of what I was being held for. So I thought, if I can get out of this, get me enough money to get a lawyer, I can beat this." That was my first thought. What would unfold in this prison over the next 2 decades would turn Holmesburg into what historians would later call the Kmart of human experimentation in post-war America. A place where desperate men would be forced to choose between their freedom and their humanity. What began as standard product testing, shampoos, lotions, toothpaste, morphed into something far more sinister under Kligman's supervision. These weren't tests for hygiene anymore. They were experiments to see how far they could push the human body without consequence. Edward Anthony discovered this reality when he signed up for a Johnson & Johnson bubble bath trial, 3 weeks of testing for $37. But the minimal pay wasn't what haunted him. Each day, researchers methodically stripped the same patch of skin from his back with adhesive tape until it was raw, applied the product directly to his open wound, and sealed it with gauze. The next day, they'd do it again, for 3 weeks straight. Sleep became impossible as the sensation crept beneath his skin. When the fever hit, his back blistered and burned, damage that lingered long after the testing ended. Anthony's story is horrific, but he wasn't alone. They moved on to radioactive isotopes, applying them to prisoners' skin without disclosure, materials known to destroy living tissue. The supposed goal was studying skin regeneration, but there was no follow-up care, no monitoring, just chemicals applied and forgotten. Some inmates later developed tumors while others battled constant fatigue, migraines, and chronic skin conditions. No one documented the long-term effects. No one seemed to want to know. And then there was the U.S. Army. Kligman worked with them to test EA3167, a nerve agent designed to cause confusion and hallucinations. Hundreds of inmates were injected in what they called threshold tests, a nice way of saying, we're going to increase the dose until something breaks. Doses jumped by 40% at a time. Some men developed paranoia, others thoughts of taking their own lives. Some who had the worst doses developed permanent memory loss, where they even forgot who they were. But the most brutal of these experiments came in the form of a chemical that really wasn't meant for humanity. It was one of the most toxic chemicals ever produced, called dioxin, and it was even a key ingredient in the infamous defoliant Agent Orange. Dow Chemical, the company behind the production of this chemical, wanted to prove it was safe enough so they could avoid government regulation. And so naturally, they turned to Holmesburg. Under the direction of Dr. Kligman, 10 prisoners were injected with varying doses of the chemical. Each man was paid just $10. The effects were immediate and brutal. The men broke out in chlorachin, severe, painful cysts and pustules that disfigured their skin. The dosage was, in some cases, over 7,500 micrograms, more than 468 times higher than Dow's own safety limits. According to court documents and internal records, even Dow's scientists were shocked by the reckless escalation. One study had to be halted because the prisoners' reactions were too severe. The list of experiments went on: high fluoride toothpaste trials, vision-damaging eye drops, antifungal creams forced into open wounds. Some men lost their eyesights, others developed infections, chest pains, and nerve damage conditions that followed them long after their release. No complete death count exists from these experiments, but one thing was clear. A lot of these men died young from cancer, heart failure, or unexplained illnesses. Most of them left Holmesburg with nothing. No diagnosis, no medical records, and no explanation for what had been done to them. What would you have done standing in their place? Would the promise of $10 have been worth the risk? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. I want to hear how this hits you. But the case in Holmesburg wasn't isolated. It was part of a much bigger pattern, a wider system that treated black bodies as disposable guinea pigs in the name of science. Just look at the Tuskegee syphilis study. For 40 years, from 1932 to 1972, the U.S. Public Health Service let hundreds of black men in Alabama suffer untreated syphilis, even after penicillin became widely available. They weren't told the truth. They weren't given proper care. They were just watched, studied, and left to die. This same exact playbook was used in Holmesburg, except that instead of signing forms they couldn't understand, there were many cases when no consent forms were presented at all. This was a clear violation of the Nuremberg Code, a code created after Nazi doctors were tried for doing the very same things in concentration camps. And while Kligman was the central figure in this horrendous crime, it really wasn't just him and his doing. Government agencies, chemical companies, pharmaceutical giants, all of them had a role. Dow Chemical, Johnson & Johnson, even the damn US Army. They all sent products to Holmesburg to be tested on prisoners, knowing full well who these men were: poor, vulnerable, and overwhelmingly black. But they put blindfolds on anyway because they all knew they could get away with it. That's where Gloria Gilman entered the picture. A Philadelphia-based civil rights attorney, Gilman became a relentless advocate for the men who had endured the experiments inside Holmesburg, who played a pivotal role in the fight for justice after the Holmesburg experiments were exposed. She became one of the most vocal legal advocates for the former inmates, representing them in legal hearings, helping them organize protests, and relentlessly pressuring the University of Pennsylvania to acknowledge its role. For years, she stood beside the survivors, often being the only legal voice willing to publicly challenge the powerful institutions that had profited from the abuse. Because just like Tuskegee, the damage didn't end with the experiments. The psychological scars and the generational trauma and distrust still echoes through Black communities today. But even though people like Gilman appeared to fight for justice and truth, it wasn't always the case. For decades, Holmesburg was actually just a rumor. But just like any dark secret, there's always a turning point of revelation. The mounting weight of survivor stories, legal advocacy, and unanswered questions eventually demanded a reckoning. And in 1998, that reckoning began when Temple University professor Alan Hornblum published Acres of Skin, a book that pulled back the curtain on everything: the experiments, the companies, the complicity. The book triggered national outrage and sparked something in the men who had survived it. Former inmates came forward, some for the first time, and formed the Experimentation Survivors Group. Their mission was clear: to get the world to recognize what happened inside Holmesburg, to demand accountability, and finally, maybe get the justice they deserved. And then they asked the university one simple question: if we made such a contribution, why don't you contribute to our rehabilitation? But justice didn't come easy. Naturally, the University of Pennsylvania denied wrongdoing. Medical officials said the inmates had consented and that the harm wasn't proven. Offers of free consultations were made, but barely a handful of former prisoners even showed up. I mean, why the hell would they trust the same institutions that had already betrayed them in the past? When survivors filed lawsuits, the system failed them again. Judges dismissed these cases and cited that the statutes of limitations had expired already. And even when apologies did come, they were far too late. Quiet, carefully worded, never paired with the kind of reparations the survivors had hoped for. But the fight hasn't ended. The Experimentation Survivors Group continues to speak out through their stories in documentaries, classrooms, and public forums. And every time their voices are heard, the message is the same: this happened. Holmesburg is the mirror of how American institutions have historically treated Black lives, as expendable guinea pigs that are only there to serve their interests. And that's what this comes down to: recognition, accountability, and a reckoning with a past that still casts a shadow over the present. If you remember earlier, we mentioned that Holmesburg wasn't the only case where Americans experimented on Black people. And this is true. In fact, at the same time this was happening, another government experiment was targeting Black Americans in Alabama. And for 40 years, hundreds of men were secretly infected with syphilis and deliberately left untreated, all in the name of science. Click here to uncover the full story of the Tuskegee syphilis study and how it changed medical ethics forever.